The wind howled across the wide plains, carrying dust that stung the skin and rattled the wooden boards of the old Carter ranch. Elias Carter sat near the fire inside his cabin, staring at the flames as they snapped and crackled. His days were long and quiet, filled with tending to the cattle, mending fences, and living in silence far from the noise of town. He had grown used to solitude after years of watching neighbors pack up, move away, or fall to the dangers of the Wild West. It was safer this way, he often told himself. Safer to rely on no one, to expect no surprises. But that night, as the storm clouds gathered above and thunder rolled in the distance, a sound reached him that shattered his usual calm. A knock at the door. It was faint at first, a timid tapping against the heavy oak, almost too soft to be real. Elias frowned, set his coffee aside, and stood. Few people ever came out this far, and those who did usually meant trouble. The storm outside made it less likely to be a friendly caller. He gripped the iron latch, hesitating for a long moment. Then the knock came again, more urgent this time. When he finally pulled open the door, the sight before him stopped him cold. A young woman stood on the porch, her dress torn and dusty, her hair tangled from wind and travel. She clutched a small bundle to her chest as if it were all she owned in the world. Her lips trembled as she looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "I can cook. I can clean. I can be quiet," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. The words struck Elias as strange, almost rehearsed, like a bargain offered before a question could even be asked. He studied her closely. Her hands were raw, her shoes worn thin, and her cheeks pale from exhaustion. Whoever she was, she had been on the road for far too long. Elias narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough from days of disuse. The woman swallowed hard. "My name is Clara May. I just need a place to rest. Only for the night, if that's all you'll allow. Please." The storm broke then, rain lashing against the porch roof and lightning splitting the sky. Elias glanced past her into the darkness and saw no horse, no wagon, nothing but empty prairie. A woman alone out here, on foot, in this weather. It was a story that didn't make sense. And yet, something in her tone, in the way she stood shivering but unyielding, stirred his guarded heart. Still, caution had kept him alive this long. "I don't take in strangers," he said firmly, gripping the doorframe. "This ain't a boarding house." Clara lowered her eyes, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of the world pressed down on her. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she did not step back. Instead, she whispered again, softer this time, almost as if she were praying. "I can cook. I can clean. I can be quiet." Elias let out a slow breath. Against his better judgment, he opened the door wider. "Get inside before you drown out there." Clara stepped over the threshold, clutching her bundle close. The cabin was plain but warm, with a fire in the hearth and simple furniture worn by years of use. She paused near the door, dripping water onto the floorboards, uncertain whether to move further. Elias shut the door and studied her in the firelight. She was younger than he first thought, perhaps mid-20s, though hardship had carved lines of weariness into her face. Her eyes, however, were striking, bright, alert, and shadowed by something unspoken. "Set your things down," Elias said at last. "There's stew left if you're hungry." She gave the faintest nod and carefully placed her bundle on a chair. When she turned back, her hands trembled slightly, but she tried to hide it. Elias ladled a bowl of stew and slid it across the table. Clara murmured a quiet thank you and ate with small, careful bites, as if unsure whether she deserved it. For a long time, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. Elias leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her with the same wary patience he used on wild horses. He wanted answers. "You traveling alone?" he finally asked. Clara froze, the spoon halfway to her lips. "Yes," she said quickly, then lowered her gaze. "From where?" She hesitated, then said, "East." Elias raised an eyebrow. "East is a long way. Got family waiting?" Her shoulders tensed. She shook her head, though she did not look up. No family. Elias frowned but did not press further. He could see her walls as clearly as the rain-streaked window pane. Forcing her would only drive her deeper into silence. After finishing the stew, Clara quietly gathered the bowl and washed it in the tin basin without being asked. She moved with practiced care, as though every small gesture was proof she meant her words. Cook, clean, be quiet. Elias said nothing, simply watching her. She seemed determined to repay even the smallest kindness, and that in itself made him curious. When the storm finally eased outside, the cabin was wrapped in a softer quiet. Clara sat near the fire, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Elias studied her once more, wondering what road had led her to his porch. He had lived long enough on the frontier to recognize when someone carried more than just a bundle of clothes. Clara carried secrets, and likely danger too. Yet he could not ignore the truth that his cabin, so long filled only with silence, felt strangely different with her presence. There was a fragile warmth, like a candle burning in the darkness. He told himself it was only for the night that come morning she would be on her way. But deep down, he suspected life had just changed, though he did not yet know how. Outside, the plain stretched vast and wild, filled with whispers of outlaws, drifters, and old grudges that never died. Whatever Clara May had left behind, Elias Carter could sense it would find its way to his door. And though he had lived content in solitude, he realized as he watched her doze by the fire that he had opened his door not just to a stranger, but to a story far larger than himself. The flames flickered, shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Elias leaned back in his chair, one hand resting near the rifle propped against the table. He did not trust easily, nor forgive lightly. But for the first time in many years he felt the stir of something he thought long gone, a reason to keep the fire burning, a reason to open the door when someone knocked. And so the night passed, quiet but heavy with the weight of unspoken truths while the storm outside rolled westward. Clara May, who had whispered her plea beneath the thunder, slept at last in safety. Elias Carter, who had vowed to live alone, sat awake watching over the cabin, knowing that by opening his door he had stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. The morning sun crept slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and cool, though the ground was damp and the prairie still carried the scent of wet earth. Elias Carter stepped out of his cabin and stretched, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the light. He expected to see Clara asleep inside, worn out from her long travels. But instead, when he glanced back through the open doorway, he saw her already moving about with quiet purpose. Clara had tied her hair back neatly, though strands still framed her face. She was busy sweeping the wooden floor with a broom that looked older than both of them. There was no hesitation in her movements, no waiting for permission. She moved as though she had promised herself she would earn her place, even if only for a day. Elias watched in silence for a while, his arms crossed. "You don't have to do that," he said finally. Clara startled, looking up at him quickly. "I said I can clean," she replied softly, almost apologetically. "I mean what I say." Elias studied her a moment longer, then gave a short nod. He wasn't used to someone else in his space, and every sound she made, the sweep of the broom, the soft clatter of a dish, was foreign to him. Yet strangely, it didn't bother him the way he thought it might. He saddled his horse and rode out to check the cattle in the fields. The herd had scattered during the storm, and it took him a good while to gather them and mend a section of fence knocked down by the wind. All the while, Clara remained in his thoughts. Who was she really? What danger had driven her here? She wasn't just some traveler who lost her way. Her eyes carried stories she wasn't ready to tell. When Elias returned hours later, he found the cabin transformed in small but noticeable ways. The floors were swept, the dishes cleaned and neatly stacked, and the windows wiped clear of dust. Clara was standing near the stove stirring a pot. The smell of beans and herbs filled the air, richer than anything Elias had cooked in months. "You cook too," he remarked, removing his hat and setting it on the peg. Clara looked at him cautiously, as though uncertain if he meant it as praise or accusation. "I told you I can cook." "It's the least I can do for your kindness." Elias washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table. She served him a plate without waiting to be asked. The food was simple, but it was hot, flavorful, and far better than the plain meals Elias usually prepared for himself. He ate in silence, but his eyes flickered to her now and then. She sat across from him, eating more slowly, her gaze often drifting toward the window as if expecting someone or something to appear on the horizon. After the meal, Elias leaned back in his chair and studied her. "You gonna tell me what brought you out here?" he asked finally. Clara stiffened, her spoon clinking softly against the plate. "I'm just passing through," she said quickly. "That's so?" "Yes," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "I'll move on soon. I don't want to be a burden." Elias narrowed his eyes. He wasn't a man who liked lies, even small ones. And though she hadn't told him much, he could see the truth hidden in her silence. She was running from someone or something. He had no doubt about it. Still, he didn't press her. People had their reasons, and sometimes forcing the truth out did more harm than good. Instead, he stood, collected the plates, and began washing them at the basin. Clara looked at him with surprise. "You don't have to," she began. Elias cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "You did the cooking. I'll do the cleaning." For the first time since she arrived, Clara smiled faintly, though it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. She rose and busied herself with mending a tear in one of her sleeves. Over the next few days, Clara settled into a quiet rhythm at the ranch. She rose early, often before Elias, and kept herself busy with chores, sweeping, mending clothes, cooking meals, tending to the small vegetable patch outside the cabin. She moved with calm determination, her words few but her actions steady. Elias, who had lived alone for so long, found himself strangely unsettled by the sound of another pair of footsteps in his cabin. Yet he also felt a kind of comfort he hadn't known in years. But even as she worked, Elias could see the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, how her shoulders tensed at the sound of approaching hooves or distant gunfire. The frontier was never quiet for long, and every man or woman carried shadows. Clara's shadows followed her even in the daylight. The townsfolk noticed soon enough. Elias rarely went into town, but when he did, he took Clara with him to buy supplies. Whispers spread quickly through the saloon and general store. A stranger woman living with Elias Carter? Folks were curious, suspicious even. Some nodded politely while others frowned, whispering behind their hands. The sheriff, a stout man named Abel Turner, approached Elias one afternoon outside the general store. "Heard you've taken in company," he said, his tone half curious, half warning. Elias met his gaze evenly. "She needed a place to stay. You know where she's from?" the sheriff asked, lowering his voice. "No," Elias admitted. The sheriff chewed on that for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Well, keep your eyes open. These lands are full of trouble, and sometimes trouble wears a pretty face." Elias bristled at the remark, but said nothing. He knew the sheriff wasn't entirely wrong. Clara carried secrets, and those secrets might well bring danger to his door. That evening, back at the cabin, Elias found Clara sitting quietly by the fire, sewing. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. He set his hat down and sat across from her. "The folks in town are curious about you," he said plainly. Her needle paused mid-stitch. "I don't blame them," she murmured. "I'd be curious too. You got something you're running from?" Elias asked. His voice was calm but firm, like a man who wouldn't be put off forever. Clara's hands tightened around the fabric in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Finally she whispered, "Yes." Elias waited, giving her space. She lifted her eyes to his, and he saw the flicker of fear there, raw and unguarded. "I was with people I shouldn't have been with. Dangerous people. I thought I could make a life there, but I was wrong. I had to leave." Elias's jaw tightened. Outlaws. He didn't need to hear the rest to know what she meant. The West was full of men who preyed on the weak, who built power through fear and cruelty. Clara had crossed paths with them, and by running she had painted a target on her back. "Do they know where you've gone?" Elias asked. She shook her head quickly. "I don't think so. I left in the night. I didn't look back." Her voice faltered, and she lowered her gaze. "But sometimes I feel like they're still behind me, like they'll find me no matter how far I run." Elias leaned back in his chair, silent for a long while. He knew she might be right. Outlaw gangs didn't let go easily, not when they believed someone had betrayed them. and now by letting her into his cabin he had tied his fate to hers. Yet as he watched her, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. She was more than just a burden or a risk. She was a woman who had faced the worst and still found the courage to knock on a stranger's door. That kind of strength was rare, and Elias respected it. "You'll stay here for now," he said firmly. "No one will harm you under my roof." Clara's eyes filled with unshed tears, though she blinked them away quickly. She gave a small nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the prairie stretched silent and endless, but inside, two lives that had once been separate now shared the same fragile peace. Neither knew how long it would last, but for that night Clara May was safe, and Elias Carter found himself no longer alone. The days passed quietly on the Carter ranch, but a heavy sense of unease began to grow. Clara May continued to help with every chore she could, from preparing meals to carrying water to patching torn clothes. She worked without complaint, her hands always busy, her voice soft whenever she spoke. Yet, despite her steady efforts, Elias noticed her glancing toward the horizon more often than ever before. Her eyes would linger on the distant line where the sky met the rolling plains, as if expecting riders to appear at any moment. Elias did not ask more questions right away. He was not a man to pry unless it was necessary, but he could sense trouble gathering in the wind. He had lived on the frontier too long not to recognize when danger was close. One morning, while Elias was tightening a fence post near the barn, Sheriff Abel Turner rode up the dirt road leading to the ranch. Dust clung to his boots as he dismounted, tipping his hat in greeting. His face was serious, his eyes sharp. Elias knew from the look on the man's face that he hadn't come for small talk. "Morning, Carter," the sheriff said. Elias nodded. "Sheriff," Turner took a slow step closer. "I came to warn you. Word is Jed Hawthorne and his men are riding this way. Folks saw them near Red Creek just yesterday." Elias's jaw tightened. Jed Hawthorne was a name that carried weight across the West, a man known for cruelty and for never letting debts go unpaid. He was the kind of outlaw who turned fear into power, and he left a trail of broken lives wherever he went. "What brings him here?" Elias asked, though in his heart he already suspected the answer. Turner glanced toward the cabin where Clara was hanging a sheet to dry on the line. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've got company. Maybe she's the reason. You know something about that?" Elias said nothing for a moment, his face calm but his mind working quickly. Finally he shook his head. "I know enough to keep her safe." The sheriff studied him, then gave a slow nod. "Hawthorne's men won't just knock politely. If they want her, they'll take her. Best be ready." With that, Turner mounted his horse again and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Elias turned back toward the cabin. Clara had noticed the sheriff's visit, and her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the damp sheet. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the truth in her eyes. She knew Jed Hawthorne was close, and she knew he was looking for her. That evening, as the fire glowed inside the cabin, Elias finally sat across from her and asked plainly, "It's Hawthorne, isn't it?" Clara's breath caught. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a voice heavy with fear, she whispered, "Yes." Elias leaned back, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me." Clara's voice shook as she began to explain. She had met Hawthorne when she was desperate, searching for work and safety in a world that offered little of either. He had seemed charming at first, promising her protection, a place among his people. But it had not taken long for her to see the truth. Hawthorne was ruthless, a man who demanded loyalty through fear. He and his gang had robbed, bullied, and harmed many. Clara had stayed as long as she could bear, hoping to slip away unnoticed. When she finally left, she took nothing but the clothes on her back and the small bundle she carried. "I thought if I went far enough, he wouldn't follow," she said softly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But men like him don't let go. He'll come for me, Elias. He'll come, and he won't stop until he finds me." Elias listened without interruption, his face stern but calm. He had always lived by one rule: never invite trouble onto your land. But now trouble had found him regardless. And though he could have told Clara to leave, to take her chances elsewhere, he knew deep down he would never do that. He had opened his door once, and now her safety was tied to his own sense of honor. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. "If Hawthorne comes here, he won't find it easy. Clara shook her head quickly, fear sparking in her voice.
You don't understand.
He has men, 10, maybe more. You can't fight them all alone. Elias gave a faint, grim smile. I've fought worse odds. Still, he knew she was right. He couldn't defend the ranch on willpower alone. He began preparing quietly, checking the rifle he kept by the door, sharpening his knife, making sure his horse and cattle were secured. He reinforced the cabin's doors and windows, driving heavy nails into the wood and cut spare boards to cover the gaps. Clara watched him work, her face pale but determined. Teach me, she said one night as he cleaned the rifle. Elias raised an eyebrow. Teach you what? How to shoot, she replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled. If they come for me, I don't want to be helpless. For a long moment, Elias considered her. She was no stranger to hardship. That much he already knew. Slowly, he handed her the rifle. First lesson, then. Clara's hands shook as she held the heavy weapon, but under Elias's calm instruction, she steadied. They practiced in the quiet of early morning, firing at old fence posts and tin cans lined up on a rail. Each shot echoed across the empty fields, a warning carried on the wind. Clara's aim was clumsy at first, but her determination made up for it. By the third day, she could hit a can at 20 paces. Elias was impressed, though he kept his praise simple. Good enough, he said. But let's hope you never have to use it. The ranch grew tense with waiting. Every creak of wood, every distant hoofbeat set Clara on edge. Elias himself slept less, his hand never far from the rifle. He knew it was only a matter of time before Hawthorne appeared. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the sky a fiery red, Elias spotted dust rising far off on the trail. His heart tightened. He lifted the spyglass he kept on the porch and saw them. Riders, a dozen at least, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun. And at the head rode a man he recognized even without having met him before. Jed Hawthorne. The outlaw leader sat tall in the saddle, his coat dark, his hat low, and his presence commanding even at a distance. Elias lowered the glass and turned toward the cabin. Clara was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with dread. They've found me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Elias placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Then they'll find me waiting. That night, the ranch was filled with silence, heavy and expectant. Elias set extra logs by the fire, loaded the rifle, and placed spare cartridges on the table. Clara helped where she could, her fear visible but her courage stronger. Together, they prepared for what was coming. And as the stars filled the sky, Elias Carter sat awake, staring into the darkness beyond the porch. He knew the West had always been unforgiving, but this time, it had brought him something worth protecting. Clara May had whispered her plea on a stormy night, and he had opened his door. Now he would stand against whatever storm came next, even if it bore the name of Jed Hawthorne. The dawn broke with a pale light that spread slowly over the plains. The air was sharp and cool, the kind of quiet that made every sound carry far. Elias Carter stood on the porch, his rifle resting against the railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had not slept much. The riders he had seen the evening before were out there, waiting, deciding when to move. He knew outlaws like Jed Hawthorne never rode this close without a reason. The reason was Clara. Inside the cabin, Clara May was stirring the fire back to life. She had dark circles under her eyes, evidence that she too had barely slept. She moved silently, but Elias noticed her hands trembling as she set the kettle over the flames. When she brought him a cup of hot coffee, she tried to mask her fear with a faint smile. They'll come today, won't they? She asked softly. Elias nodded. Most likely. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. You don't have to do this for me. Elias met her gaze firmly. I opened my door. That means you're under my roof. I don't hand people over to men like Hawthorne. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. Instead, she gave a small nod and looked away, the firelight glinting off the tears she refused to shed. By mid-morning, dust rose again from the trail leading toward the ranch. A dozen riders appeared, their horses kicking up clouds as they drew closer. Elias stood tall on the porch, rifle in hand, his face calm but set. Clara hovered behind the doorway, peering out with wide eyes. Jed Hawthorne led the group, his dark coat flapping in the wind, his hat casting a shadow over his cold eyes. He pulled his horse to a stop a few yards from the cabin and raised his hand. The men behind him fanned out, their hands resting on their weapons. Carter, Hawthorne called, his voice deep and commanding. "You've got something that belongs to me." Elias didn't move. "Nothing here belongs to you." Hawthorne gave a humorless smile. "The girl. Clara May. She ran from me, and I don't take kindly to runaways." His eyes narrowed. "Hand her over, and I'll let you live in peace. Refuse, and you'll regret it." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she listened. Elias shifted his stance, steady and unflinching. "She's not yours," he said flatly. The outlaw leader's smile vanished. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes burning with anger. "You think you can stand against me and my men? One rancher alone?" Elias's voice was steady as stone. "I've stood alone before, but I'm not as alone as you think." Even as he spoke, movement stirred from the distance. A small group of townsfolk, men Elias knew from the store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop, rode up the trail. At their head was Sheriff Turner, his badge gleaming faintly in the sun. They slowed their horses and formed a line a short distance behind Elias's cabin. Word had spread, and though they were not soldiers, these people had decided to stand with him. Hawthorne turned his head, his eyes narrowing at the sight of them. "Fools," he growled. "Do you really want to die for her?" No one answered. The silence was heavy, broken only by the restless snorting of horses. Elias raised his rifle slightly. "You've got a choice, Hawthorne. Turn around and ride out or test your luck here." For a moment, the outlaw leader simply stared, his jaw tight. Then he threw back his head and laughed, the sound harsh and cold. "So be it." He raised his hand and dropped it quickly. "Men!" The first shots cracked through the air, sharp and deafening. Clara ducked behind the doorframe, her heart pounding. Elias fired back from the porch, his aim steady. The townsfolk joined in, rifles and pistols blazing. The battle for the ranch had begun. Smoke filled the air as gunfire echoed across the plains. Hawthorne's men rode hard, trying to circle the cabin, but Elias had prepared. The fences had been reinforced, creating barriers that slowed their charge. From the porch, Elias fired shot after shot, forcing the riders to scatter. Sheriff Turner and the others pressed forward, cutting off the outlaws' flanks. Clara clutched the spare rifle Elias had shown her how to use. Her hands shook, but she remembered his calm instructions. When one of Hawthorne's men broke away and tried to rush the cabin, she raised the weapon, aimed with all the courage she could gather, and fired. The shot rang true, driving the man back in retreat. Elias glanced at her through the smoke and gave a brief nod. There was no time for words, but his eyes spoke what he felt: pride, respect, and trust. The fight raged on, fierce and desperate. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the crack of rifles never ceased. Dust and smoke blurred the scene, but Elias moved with calm precision, every shot measured, every step purposeful. Clara stayed close, loading cartridges, handing him supplies, and firing when she had a chance. Hawthorne himself dismounted, striding forward with a revolver in each hand. His presence was commanding, his voice carrying above the chaos. "You can't hide her, Carter." "She's mine!" Elias stepped down from the porch, his rifle steady. "She was never yours." The two men faced each other across the yard, the noise of the fight dimming for a heartbeat as if the world held its breath. Then Hawthorne fired and Elias dropped low, rolling to the side as the bullet shattered the porch railing. He fired back, his shot grazing Hawthorne's arm. The outlaw cursed, his rage boiling over. Clara cried out, but Elias was already moving, ducking behind a barrel for cover. Hawthorne advanced, determined to end it himself. The clash became personal now, one man against another, while the rest of the fight carried on around them. At last, as Hawthorne raised his revolver again, a sharp report split the air, not from Elias but from behind. Sheriff Turner had taken aim and fired, the bullet striking Hawthorne's side. The outlaw leader staggered, his face twisted with fury and pain. Elias rose from cover, his rifle leveled. "It's over," Elias said firmly. For a moment, Hawthorne swayed, his breath ragged. Then with a final growl, he dropped his weapon. His men, seeing their leader fall, faltered. Some threw down their arms, while others spurred their horses and fled into the distance. The gunfire slowly ceased, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the crackle of smoke. The yard was littered with broken fences, spent shells, and the marks of battle. Clara stepped out from the cabin, her face pale but her eyes burning with relief. She looked at Elias, who stood tall, his rifle still in hand. He met her gaze, and for a moment the world seemed to quiet around them. The townsfolk gathered, binding the captured outlaws and checking the wounded. Sheriff Turner approached Elias, giving a respectful nod. You stood your ground, Carter. Couldn't have done it without you. Elias glanced at Clara, then back at the sheriff. We couldn't have done it without all of us. Clara's hands were still trembling, but when Elias moved toward her, she steadied. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She had faced her fear, stood against the men who hunted her, and survived. As the sun set that evening, the ranch was quiet again. The danger had passed, though the memory of the fight lingered in every scar left behind. Clara sat by the fire, her shawl wrapped around her, staring at the flames. Elias sat beside her, silent but steady. For the first time since she had knocked on his door, Clara felt a fragile sense of safety settling over her. The storm had come, and together they had faced it. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but in that moment she was not alone. And Elias, who had once sworn to live in solitude, found himself watching her with a quiet realization. The world outside was harsh and unforgiving, but in opening his door to her he had discovered something worth fighting for. The dust of the battle slowly settled, leaving the Carter ranch marked with scars of struggle. The broken fences, the scattered shells, and the burnt wood carried the memory of what had happened. But beneath all of that there was also silence, the kind of silence that followed after danger had passed, heavy but filled with relief. Clara May sat by the fire inside the cabin that evening, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Elias had poured for her. She had not spoken much since the fight, but her eyes told the story of her gratitude and the weight lifting from her shoulders. Elias moved about quietly, checking the locks, tending to the cattle, making sure nothing had been left undone. He was tired, though he did not show it. His body ached from the long hours of standing guard and the strain of facing down Jed Hawthorne, but his spirit carried something new, something he had not felt in years. He had stood for someone else, not just for himself. He had taken a risk that once he would have avoided. And now, seeing Clara safe by the fire, he knew he would take that risk again without question. The next morning, the townsfolk returned to gather the captured men and carry them away. Sheriff Turner thanked Elias once more, reminding him that the law would take care of what was left of Hawthorne's gang. The outlaw leader himself, wounded but alive, had been hauled off under heavy guard. For the first time in a long time, the people of the town felt a sense of victory against the fear that had haunted them, and many of them looked to Elias with respect, not just as a quiet rancher, but as a man who had stood when it mattered. When the dust of visitors cleared and only the prairie stretched around them again, Clara and Elias found themselves alone once more. The cabin felt different now. It was no longer just a shelter against storms or a quiet place to eat and sleep. It was something more. Clara began putting the cabin back in order, sweeping the floors, setting things right where the fight had left them in disarray. She hummed softly under her breath, not realizing Elias was listening. The sound was gentle, almost fragile, but to him it carried warmth that filled the room more than the fire ever could. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her, and for the first time allowed himself a small smile. "You don't have to keep working so hard," he said quietly. She paused, turning to look at him. "I told you I can cook, I can clean, I can—" Her voice faltered as she remembered her first words to him at the door. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "I can be quiet." Elias stepped into the room, his eyes soft. "You don't have to be quiet anymore, Clara, not here." Her throat tightened and she lowered her gaze. "I didn't think I'd ever be safe again," she admitted. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life running, always looking over my shoulder. But you opened your door. You gave me more than I asked for." Elias moved closer, resting one hand on the back of a chair. "Sometimes life surprises us. I thought I was done with company. Thought I'd spend the rest of my days in silence. But now," he let the thought trail off, the words unspoken but understood. Days turned into weeks and the ranch began to feel whole again. Clara planted new seeds in the garden, repairing the small patch that had been trampled in the fight. She mended the curtains and even stitched new covers for the chairs. Elias worked on the fences, replacing broken posts and making sure the cattle stayed secure. They found a rhythm together, a balance between his quiet strength and her gentle determination. The townsfolk continued to talk about them. Some were curious, others supportive, but Clara no longer cared what was whispered in the saloon or the store. For the first time in years, she felt at home. The shadows of her past still lingered, but they no longer held her captive. One evening after a long day of work, Elias and Clara sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the prairie in shades of orange and gold. The air was calm, filled only with the chirp of crickets and the distant call of birds settling for the night. Clara leaned against the railing, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. Elias sat beside her, his hat resting on his knee. "Do you ever think about the future?" Clara asked softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Elias thought for a moment before answering. "I used to think there wasn't much future for me. Just more days, more chores, the same routine until the end, but now I reckon I think about it more." Clara turned her head, studying his face in the fading light. "And what do you see?" He met her gaze steadily. "I see this ranch. I see the cattle, the fences, the sky above. But I also see you in it. That makes all the difference." Her eyes glistened and she quickly looked down, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have," she whispered. "A place where I belong." The silence between them was gentle, not heavy as it once had been. It was the silence of comfort, of knowing words were not always needed. Elias reached over, placing his hand lightly over hers. She did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand to hold his, her fingers trembling but strong. The seasons began to change. The prairie shifted from the green of spring to the golden waves of summer. Life continued, steady and sure, but different than before. Elias no longer moved through his days as if waiting for nothing. Clara was beside him, and every small moment carried meaning. Meals shared, chores done together, evenings by the fire. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined Clara. She had been a fugitive, a woman running from fear, but now she was more. She was a partner, a presence that turned the cabin into a home. And Elias, once a solitary figure on the edge of town, was no longer just a quiet rancher. He was a man who had chosen to fight, not for glory or recognition, but for the chance to give someone safety, and in doing so, had found his own peace. One night, as the stars stretched endless above them, Clara whispered again the words she had spoken the first time they met. "I can cook. I can clean. I can be quiet." Her voice was soft, almost playful now. Elias chuckled low, shaking his head. "You don't need to promise me those things anymore." She tilted her head, her eyes curious. "Then what do you want from me?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady, his voice quiet but strong. "Just stay. That's all I want. Stay." Clara's heart swelled at the simple request. She smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide. "Then I will." The wind rustled gently through the grass. The fire inside the cabin burned warm, and for the first time in a long time, both Elias and Clara knew they had found what they had been searching for. Not riches, not fame, not even safety alone, but belonging. The Wild West was still harsh, still filled with danger, but within the walls of that cabin, a promise had been made. And so the story of a woman who whispered her worth and a man who chose to open his door became something greater than either had expected. It became a story of trust, of courage, and of finding a home where there once was only emptiness.